Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea, and in today's interview with Tommy P. Cowan, we're going to be discussing the fascinating William Burroughs. Tommy and I met and became friends during our Research Master program at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and I'm very happy that he agreed to share his research with everyone today. Tommy holds a BA in anthropology with the distinction of summa cum laude from the University of California, Sacramento, where he is from, as well as a research master in religious studies, also with the distinction of cum laude from the University of Amsterdam. He currently holds the position of assistant editor of Correspondences, the journal for the study of esotericism. In part one, Tommy will be delving into Burroughs' background and explaining how Burroughs' experiences influenced his worldview and naturally his writing. We also discuss some important research findings of Tommy's concerning the Mayan 2012 prophecy and the link to Burroughs, the importance of the alien insect overlords found in Burroughs' writings, and expand further on Burroughs' interest in the occult, including why most literary critics ignore this aspect of Burroughs entirely. It's a pretty deep dive, so strap on your oxygen mask and jump in. Welcome to the podcast, Tommy, and thanks for being here. You have graciously agreed to talk with me today about William Burroughs and your research into his work. And I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you again. It's been a long time. So welcome. We're not going to be able, of course, to talk about everything concerning William Burroughs, but hopefully we'll be able to make a good start and discuss some of your very interesting findings. So as you are aware, this podcast attempts to act as a bridge between the academic and the mainstream spheres, with a special focus on how the topic at hand expresses itself in popular culture. With Burroughs, however, it is almost redundant to ask how his work has influenced pop culture, because his name is practically synonymous with counterculture. And he is so influential in so many areas. For example, the Beat Generation and the poets associated with that movement, such as Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, as well as being an important figure to many musicians and artists, such as the Beatles, David Bowie, Andy Warhol, Steely Dan, Laurie Anderson, REM, Ministry, and Genesis P-Orridge, just to name a few. So many people have heard of him and his work, and I would guess, however, that many don't fully understand what he was trying to achieve with his work. And I have to say that until I met you, I was part of that group of people. I mean, I knew how he had influenced artists like David Bowie with the cut-up method, but that's kind of where, I guess, kind of where it ended for me. But in order to put Burroughs into context for our discussion today, let's start out with a short biography and a basic outline of the history of William Burroughs and his work until the 1960s. And of course, there's a lot to unpack here, but I think it's important to know this so that we can understand the rest of the discussion that we're going to have. So please take it away.
Oh, excellent. Yes. And yeah, let me just say thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to keep this as short as I can, but I still hit all of the major points that I think we should hit.
Yeah, okay.
So first of all, William Burroughs was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1914. He was the youngest of two boys, and his family was pretty wealthy because his paternal grandfather was an inventor and an entrepreneur. So he grew up very privileged in a certain sense. You know, he was pampered. He received a very good education. He lived in a big house. They had servants, and he had a very close, being the youngest son, he had a very close relationship with his mother. He was adored by his mom. So it seems kind of like an ideal childhood in certain ways. However, something very bad happened to him when he was 4 years old. And it's something involving his nanny that scarred him really badly. And we don't know exactly what it is because his memory of the event is hazy. It's very vague. And he spent years in psychoanalysis trying to reconstruct what happened, but he never quite pieced it together with any great clarity. One of his initial theories was that he was forced to perform oral sex on his nanny's boyfriend, who was a local veterinarian. And if you read the latest Burroughs biography written by Barry Miles, titled Call Me Burroughs, Miles seems to think that this is the most likely scenario of any of the scenarios that Burroughs had come up with.
I see.
Yeah.
That's heavy.
It's heavy is a good adjective. But at any rate, even though we don't know exactly what happened, it's safe to say that some form of sexual abuse occurred on the day in question.
I see.
And after this event, his nanny was fired and she moved back to the UK. The reason why I mention this, why I think this is an important event in his life, is that about 1 year later, when he's 5 years old, he begins reporting these strange experiences of these anxiety attacks, where he claimed that he feels this evil presence all around him in the air, and this sort of invisible entity that was threatening him with this dark and like hateful kind of energy. And it was so powerful that it would make him break down and cry. And there's stories of, he had an older brother, and his brother would ask him, "Billy, what's wrong?" And he couldn't explain it. It was just this invisible force that was attacking him. And Professor Jeffrey Kripal has noted before the overlap between people who get sexually abused and people who have anomalous or mystical experiences. There seems to be some kind of connection there. And so I think it's important to note that these terrifying experiences that Burroughs has with these intermediary beings is not long after his sexual trauma.
Okay.
So I think it's important to note that. And when we read Burroughs' writing, not only is it obvious that Burroughs is obsessed with sex and obsessed with violence and extremely paranoid, but also much of his interest in things like demons and magic often centers around sex. So, for example, he claimed that intermediary beings were interested in having sex with humans, which is one of the reasons he becomes interested in Whitley Strieber's stories later on in his life. He was also interested in figures like Wilhelm Reich and Aleister Crowley. He's interested in sex magic. He's interested in ways in which sex can alter consciousness. So in my opinion, when we look at his writing, for many reasons, I think it's evident that this childhood trauma informs not only the person that he became, but also the writer that he became. And that's not to essentialize such a complex figure as Burroughs, but I think it's fair to say that his childhood trauma is sort of a central building block of his character and his corpus.
Indeed.
And it's also something I feel maybe that a lot of Burroughs scholars have yet to sufficiently discuss. Maybe that's just my perception. So anyways, moving on. After high school, he's educated at Harvard, where he graduated with a degree in English literature. But beyond Harvard, he never really took to any kind of career. He makes various stabs at grad school, including going to medical school in Vienna for one semester, sort of like right on the eve of the outbreak of World War II, or maybe not the outbreak of World War II, but certainly the Nazis' rise to power. He studied anthropology at Columbia University. He studied Mayan archaeology at Mexico City College, but he never really finishes anything after his bachelor's. And he moved around a lot, like all over the U.S., moves around in Europe, holds several odd jobs here and there, worked as an exterminator, worked as a private investigator, as a newspaperman, but nothing too serious. Then in 1943, at almost 30 years old, he moves back to New York and he meets Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Joan Vollmer, who would later become his common law wife. And these three men, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs, they sort of formed the core of what would later be known as beat literature. at this time, Burroughs is older than they are, so he's very much sort of a mentor figure to them. He introduced them to lots of authors like Oswald Spengler and Hart Crane, various other people. And then another weird tragedy sort of befalls him, not directly, but sort of indirectly. And this is a very famous part of beat lore. And there's been a movie made about it called, I believe it's called Kill Your Darlings. Mm-hmm. In 1944, one of their friends named Lucian Carr, who was sort of the networking guru whom the early beat circle formed around, he murdered another friend of theirs named David Kammerer by stabbing him and dumping him in a river.
Oh.
Apparently in self-defense over what Carr claimed was a sexual assault. Burroughs was friends with both Carr and Kammerer for years at that point. They were all St. Louis boys originally. And so this was really shocking to the burgeoning beat circle, and it had a big impact on them. And the reason why this event is important, why I mention it, is because Kerouac and Burroughs decided to write a novel about the event. And the novel was titled, "And the Hippos Were Boiled in Their Tanks." And so technically this is the first book that Burroughs ever writes, but it was never published in his lifetime. So I don't think he was very fond of it. It's really nothing special. It's just kind of a very straightforward narrative about impoverished young white people in wartime New York.
And what year was this again?
The murder is in 1944.
44, okay. And the
and
book?
Then I believe him and Jack work on this book over a period of the next couple of years.
Okay.
But it eventually goes under the floorboards somewhere, or in someone, I forget what happens to the manuscript, but it goes unpublished in their lifetimes. Mm-hmm. Burroughs dies in 1997, but the book isn't published until 2008.
Oh, okay.
Right,
but he wasn't really he didn't really mention it at all when he would talk about books that he had written.
No, not really. It's not something that I think, if you read about this book, Kerouac was always trying to bring the book back out of obscurity and get it published again because he thought it had potential. But Burroughs really didn't care about it.
Okay.
And I think one of the reasons why it was never published in Jack's lifetime is because they remained friends with Lucian Carr, and Carr didn't want them to publish this book.
I see.
I think like I said, the book's nothing special, and it's maybe the least esoteric book that Burroughs ever wrote. But I think it's worth looking at for a Burroughs scholar, because there's still pieces of esotericism in there. So it's not completely devoid of weird spirituality. So we can see, like, even in the very beginning, he still manages ways to sort of work in his unique spirituality into everything he does. So moving on, besides becoming the pillar of the nascent kind of beat circle, the next most pivotal thing that happened to Burroughs before he left New York was that he started experimenting with morphine for the first time. And this would go on to be a lifelong struggle for him. He'd be addicted to opiates off and on for the remaining 50 years of his life. He eventually leaves New York around 1946 with Joan Vollmer, who was then pregnant. And they bounced around Texas and Louisiana for a while until he gets into legal trouble in Louisiana over drug possession charges. I believe he gets caught with marijuana and a very small amount of heroin, if I recall correctly. And as a result of which, he decides to flee the country and go to Mexico in the fall of 1949. And Mexico is a really pivotal point in his life. It's sort of when a lot of things changed for him. And two very important things happened to him while he was there. First of all, in 1950, he starts writing the first book that he would ever publish, titled Junkie. It's essentially a pretty straightforward, creative nonfiction about his experiences with opiate addiction. But again, even though it's not a super esoteric novel, there's still some esoteric stuff in there, right? So we see this pattern even in his most straightforward work. He still manages to talk about his spirituality in certain sections. For example, on the first page of Junkie, he recounts a memory from his childhood about having these terrible nightmares. And I have a quote here that I'd like to read, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is the first page. Actually, my earliest memories are colored by a fear of nightmares. I was afraid to be alone and afraid of the dark and afraid to go to sleep because of dreams where a supernatural horror seemed always on the point of taking shape. I was afraid someday the dream would still be there when I woke up. I recall hearing a maid talk about opium and how smoking opium brings sweet dreams, and I said, I will smoke opium when I grow up. I was subject to hallucinations as a child. Once I woke up in the early morning light and saw little men playing in a blockhouse I had made. I felt no fear, only a feeling of stillness and wonder. Another recurrent hallucination or nightmare concerned animals in the wall and started with the delirium of a strange, undiagnosed fever that I had at the age of 4 or 5. If you recall, as I spoke previously, 4 and 5, this is around the time that he suffers this traumatic abuse.
Yes.
So in this quote here, we see that Burroughs, by putting this info on the first page, it sort of sets the whole vibe of the novel against this backdrop of malevolent demons.
Yeah.
Against the backdrop of his own sensitivity to perceive supernatural events or intermediary beings, and as well as a backdrop of his penchant for using opiates as a form of coping with the stress of being what we might call a psychically sensitive person.
Right.
Also, on the last page of Junkie, he talks about ayahuasca, which he calls yahe at the time. And as many people know, this is a very powerful hallucinogen from South America. And he speaks of ayahuasca not only as a potential cure for opiate addiction, but he also talks about it as a method for achieving telepathic communication. And so this is also significant to me because the ayahuasca angle would reemerge in his next 2 books called Queer and Yahe Letters. Moving on, the second most important thing that happens to Burroughs in Mexico is that he accidentally kills his wife in 1951. And this irrevocably sort of changes everything for him. And basically all of his writing after Vollmer's death is different. And I'll get into how that is in a minute. But first, I'd like to tell the story of how she died, if I may.
Yes, please do. It's important.
So it should be noted that Burroughs and Vollmer had a very problematic marriage. First of all, even though by all accounts they had a good sex life in general, Burroughs was still homosexual at heart, and he refused to surrender this part of his identity and his lifestyle. So they had kind of an open marriage to an extent. And just prior to the accident in which Vollmer died, Burroughs had been roaming around South America for a couple of months with a male prostitute that he was in love with named Louis Marker. And even though Marker didn't really reciprocate this genuine affection, and Burroughs had returned to Mexico just a couple of days before the accident. So needless to say that Vollmer wasn't too pleased about his recent vacation, sort of abandoning her with the kids, let's say. Mm-hmm. So on the night of her death, I'm sure there was certainly some tension between them. And I think this is kind of one of the things that people bring up if they suspect that maybe Burroughs killed her on purpose, is that there's this underlying tension at the time. Although that's not what my opinion is. I believe it was an accident. Another problem that their marriage suffered from is that they were both drug addicts. Vollmer had been an amphetamine addict for years, and by the time of her death, though, neither of them were using drugs, but because neither of them were on drugs at the time, they were sort of substituting their drugs of choice with alcohol. They were basically both full-blown alcoholics at this phase of their lives. And as I'm about to explain, alcohol would play a huge part in her death. So as the story goes, Burroughs is walking down the street one afternoon, and he has this mysterious emotional episode in public where he starts crying, and he doesn't know why he's crying. And then he gets overwhelmed with this strange feeling of deja vu. And part of this deja vu is a revelation that some awful tragedy is about to occur on this day. So he's filled with immense anxiety about this impending doom, and in an attempt to manage this anxiety, he begins drinking very heavily. Later that night, he meets up with Vollmer at a friend's apartment, and they both continue drinking there. Joan drank every day, all day, pretty much as soon as she got up. She was sort of like a maintenance alcoholic. She was always sipping on something. What apparently happened is that Vollmer sort of teased Burroughs about his marksmanship ability. And Burroughs was known to be a very good marksman. It was something that he took pride in. He'd been shooting guns since he was a kid. He was apparently very talented with a pistol. So obviously she's trying to antagonize him a little bit and kind of make fun of him. And but he sort of apparently maybe feels slightly offended by this and sort of considers this a challenge to his marksmanship here and his masculinity. So he suggests to her to place a highball glass on top of her head so that he could shoot it off, sort of as a demonstration for the other people at the party. And one of the spectators present at this party is Louis Marker, this man that he was in love with. So it's likely that Burroughs is doing this to try and impress him. I should also note it's disputed as to whether or not they had tried this sort of William Tell act before. Burroughs always denied that they'd ever tried this before, but I think there's reasons not to believe him because he's been known to lie about this event on multiple occasions in multiple ways. And there's actually a friend of Burroughs and Vollmer's from their time in Texas who claimed that they once saw Burroughs shoot an orange off of her head at a party. So not only are there witnesses of previous instances, but also Vollmer agrees to this sort of insane suggestion very quickly and easily.
Yeah, that seems quite odd. I don't think I would agree.
Right.
Especially if you've been drinking all day.
Right. Well, we can imagine that her alcohol intake probably gave her a certain amount of bravery or certainly casualness about it.
Yes.
But I think based on all of these circumstances, it seems likely to me that they had done this a number of times, but we really don't know.
Okay.
So anyways, she puts this glass on top of her head and she turns to the side. He pulls out a pistol and he stands about 6 to 7 feet away, which is not that far, but it's apparently far enough to miss. And the bullet hits her in the skull just above the temple, kind of near her hairline, I believe. Obviously, chaos ensues after this. People sober up very quickly. They get her to a hospital, but she dies at the hospital. And so in an attempt, Burroughs was arrested for manslaughter for a period of time. He gets out on bail because he had a very good lawyer, and he goes back to the apartment to sort of try and get his kids squared away. They ended up going back to the U.S. and being raised by their grandparents and stuff like that. But in the throes of his anguish over this horrible, stupid mistake, he goes back to this emotional deja vu episode that he had earlier that day. And so he kind of starts putting two and two together, and he now believes that his wife's death was a tragedy that the universe was somehow trying to warn him about. Obviously this is the greatest tragedy of his lifetime. He kills the only woman he ever loved, destroys his family, disappoints all his family and friends. It's just an error of the most profound magnitude. It goes without saying. And he never really comes to accept it on materialistic terms, meaning that as a consequence of his grief over what he did, he develops sort of a theory of demonic possession, where he eventually comes to argue that an evil spirit had literally entered his body and made him suggest this crazy thing and made him miss. And this preoccupation with the concept of possession becomes a very important part of his writing. So sort of moving on from there, the third book that Burroughs writes, and this is the first book after Joan's death, which he also worked on in Mexico. This is essentially an unfinished sequel to Junkie called Queer. And it's a creative nonfiction about his affair with Louis Marker. But he stops working on it at some point, I believe around 1953 maybe, or 1952, 53. And it remained unpublished for more than 30 years. It doesn't get published until 85. To be honest with you, my opinion, it's not a great book. I mean, it's okay. It has moments. But when you look at it today, it's very interesting for Burroughs scholars because it marks the beginning of what Burroughs calls the routine. And so the routine is essentially just kind of like a short story or like a little short scenario that's essentially intended for comedic purposes. And these routines, as he calls them, they originate in his attempts to kind of woo Lewis Marker and impress this younger man with like his wit and his humor. And they often involve rather crass or kind of foul, offensive subject matter, but in a comedic way. For example, I think one of the routines in Queer is about him visiting a sex slave dealership where he tries to trade in an adolescent boy slave for like a younger model. And the comedic angle of this routine sort of revolves around this symbolic comparison of these sex slaves to used cars. And it sounds really horrible and offensive.
It does sound very offensive.
Which it is, fair enough. But, he does it with a lot of wit and poise, and it's actually very funny at the same time. This is sort of the cognitive dissonance of Burroughs, is that he writes these really horrible, offensive things, but does it in a very comedic way. So it's a very interesting reading experience.
Right.
So anyways, the routine is very important here because it sort of becomes the core methodology in the main unit of composition for most of his major works after Queer. So Queer is the first book where the routine plays a minor yet significant role, but after Queer, the routine becomes more important. And another thing about these routines that we should note is the manner in which he develops them. So because he frequently developed these routines as letters to friends and frequently letters sent to younger men that he was in love with, namely Lewis Marker, but also Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg will go on to become his first literary agent. So there's this epistolary nature to this era of his career. So we see kind of like in the depths of his despair, trying to deal with his grief over what happened with his wife, he's using comedy writing in his correspondences with other love interests as a coping mechanism. And I think this relationship that he has between grief and writing writing as a means of escape from grief basically defines his career after Joan's death.
Interesting.
So moving on, in 1953, he leaves Mexico. He goes on an extended journey in South America, where he actually ends up trying ayahuasca in Colombia and Peru. And during this trip, he writes a number of letters to Allen Ginsberg, which inspires Ginsberg's own South American journey for ayahuasca in 1960. During Ginsberg's trip in 1960, he and Burroughs exchanged more letters then. And a combination of the 1953-1960 letters were compiled for this book called the Yahe Letters, which was eventually published in 1963, along with some additional material that they both had. After South America, his next major international adventure, so to speak, was in Tangier. Burroughs moves there in 1954, and he lives there for about 4 years. It's a significant portion of his Tangier time was spent injecting opiates, to be honest. But when he wasn't on opiates, he was doing a lot of writing there. And this included many letters and routines that he would send to Ginsberg and other friends. And eventually, Ginsberg, acting as his muse and also literary agent, encourages him to compile these routines into a book of some kind. So when Burroughs leaves Tangier in 1958, he's got a collection of routines that totals over 1,000 pages. And Ginsberg usually referred to this collection as the word hoard. So, he's got this really large stack of writing that they're trying to figure out what to do with. And much of the material for Burroughs' upcoming major works in the early to mid 1960s is extracted from the word hoard, including his most famous novel, Naked Lunch. Burroughs leaves Tangier in 1958 for Paris, I believe 1958. I think at certain points Burroughs claims he leaves Tangier in 59, but I've read other places I believe he arrives in Paris in 58. He moves into sort of a cheap, rundown hotel there on a street called the Rue Guillecourt. And this hotel is very popular with sort of expat bohemians at the time. Ginsberg and Gregory Corso were staying there. And in later years, this hotel would be referred to as the Beat Hotel because of all the famous beat artists that lodged there. And so staying at the Beat Hotel now, the next major event for Burroughs, artistically and spiritually, is he befriends an artist named Brian Geisen. Geisen's a very, very interesting figure. He was a painter and a writer. He was briefly involved with the Surrealists in Paris much earlier, but was sort of a legendary sort of raconteur in the Tangier expat scene in the 1950s. He owned a very popular restaurant there for a time. And what's interesting is that he claims that he lost the restaurant because a staff member had used magic against him to summon a jinn in order to have him banished, which is why he has to leave Morocco and go back to Paris for a fresh start.
Right. And a jinn is a type of spirit entity, what Americans would call like a genie. Correct.
Exactly. Yes, it's a intermediate class of intermediary being in the Islamic world. And what's also interesting is that Burroughs and Geisen were acquaintances in Tangier, but they didn't like each other at the time. They kind of thought they didn't want to hang out with each other. They'd both heard bad things of each other. I think Geisen had maybe heard some stories about Burroughs, about him probably being an addict and maybe killing his wife and these kinds of things. And he doesn't really want to know Burroughs.
Yeah.
And Burroughs probably senses this animosity and kind of writes Geisen off. But now that they're both in Paris, I believe they bump into each other on the street somewhere. They start chatting, and Burroughs asks Geisen if he wants to smoke hashish, and Geisen says, "Oh yeah, of course." So they very quickly sort of become best friends, and Geisen moves into the Beat Hotel. And he had a huge influence on Burroughs. And so this kind of Geisen-Burroughs era of the Beat Hotel is inundated with esoteric practices. They're using drugs, hashish, mescaline. They're experimenting with meditation. They're experimenting with mirror scrying. They're listening to Sufi trance music that eventually goes on to be known as the master musicians of Jajuka, this album produced with Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones. They're reading Scientology. They're getting to all sorts of weird kind of iconoclastic, mind-altering activities at this time. And neither of them have any sort of stable jobs. So when they're doing this full time, pretty much. So it gets really weird. And it's rumored that sort of these other bohemian artists living in the Beat Hotel are kind of getting a little spooked. They're kind of becoming a little afraid of Burroughs and Geisen at some point because it's just getting too far out. For example, there's several reported sightings of intermediary beings in the Beat Hotel around this time. And as far as I can tell, Burroughs and Geisen did not believe these things were hallucination. They believed that what they saw there was real.
Were they the only ones seeing the intermediary beings, or were other people also seeing these beings?
So this is what's interesting. Other people have also seen these things too. Okay. And this is one of the things that convinces Burroughs that it's not a hallucination, is that Burroughs has this vision or this hallucination, however you want to call it. And then later on, someone else has a similar vision or hallucination that sort of matches the phenomenology of what he saw. So he goes, aha, like it's not me. This is a thing. This has been independently verified.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, it gets weird. It gets really weird in there basically around this time.
Okay.
In 1959, Ginsberg gets some sections of the Naked Lunch manuscript published in an American literary magazine called Big Table. These excerpts contain some really offensive and controversial material, and this generates like a lot of scandal over censorship and sort of there was still a lot of literary censorship that went on in America at that time. So in addition to this Big Table publicity, Kerouac and Ginsberg are also kind of gaining notoriety in the literary world, and they're they promote Burroughs in their own work as this sort of legendary outlaw artist, and which is how they got him included in this Big Table magazine. And so based on all the controversy now surrounding Burroughs, he draws the attention of a French publishing company called Olympia. And Olympia asks him to send over a manuscript, I believe within like a very short period of time. They say like, we want it within 2 weeks. But this manuscript is a mess. He's dealing with this sort of 1,000-page mess of stuff. And, and he's off and on drugs and smoking hash all the time and stuff like that. So this is a daunting task for him to put together this manuscript in a very short time period. So he enlists the help of several friends, I believe, including Brian Geisen, and they help him out, like retyping and editing and organizing. And he puts together the best manuscript he can. And at that point, the novel was called, when it was published, it was called The Naked Lunch. And it appears in France in 1959. And this is his fourth book, but only the second book publication. And it's far and away certainly still his most famous and his best-selling book. And it's essentially the main reason why we know who he is today. Before I wrap up this bio here, I'd like to make a note about Naked Lunch's style, if I can.
Okay.
Insofar as it's a huge departure from the previous three books that he wrote. So Naked Lunch basically abandons the idea of a fixed character or a linear narrative. And it's the first book he writes where the Burroughs routine isn't just a component within this overarching narrative, but it's now the central focal point of the book. So what we have here is kind of like an assemblage of vignettes or sort of stories that it's not really promoted as an assemblage of vignettes, nor is it promoted as a collection of short stories. So it kind of masquerades as a novel. And when people saw this in 1959, it was very unusual, and it generated a lot of discussion, both for and against it. So anyways, pretty much all of his major works after Naked Lunch adhere to this new routine-centric style that's emblematic of the Burroughs brand. Okay. But yeah, and that takes us right up to 1960, right before the birth of Cut Up.
Okay. Before we get into Cut Up, I'd like to talk about something else first. If we could stay around this same year of 1960. In your very interesting research master thesis, you suggest that there's a link between a particular book by William Burroughs that he wrote. Did he write it in 1960 or was it published in 1960?
Both.
Okay, both. And this book, so that there's a link between this book and the 2012 Mayan apocalyptic prophecy that was a major talking point all over, at least all over the North American continent. I'm not certain. I mean, I remember hearing about all of this all of the time. This is before I studied at university for religious studies and getting into Western esotericism. So it was just something that was just kind of everywhere. It's like everywhere you turned, you heard about 2012 and that there was going to be this major event happening in 2012. But uncannily, it's like, very surprisingly, Burroughs seems to be referencing this in this 1960 book. So can you explain this connection and why this hasn't received much attention from other authors or scholars?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do my best. When I started my master's degree at the University of Amsterdam in 2017, I was speaking with the department head at the time, Professor Wouter Hanegraaf, and I was sort of picking his brain for ideas about what I should write my thesis on because I wasn't sure yet. And he suggested I look into Terence McKenna, and he referred me to an article that he wrote some years earlier where he claims that the 2012 prophecy ultimately stems from this Terence McKenna book called The Invisible Landscape. The Invisible Landscape was originally published in 1975. So I had this information kind of in the back of my mind. And some months later, I was writing an essay for Professor Marco Passi, And the essay was about Burroughs, because I'd been a Burroughs fan for a while at that point, and I'd read Naked Lunch years before as an undergrad. And so I was reading stuff for the Burroughs essay, and I saw that the university library had a copy of this 1960 book called The Exterminator, which is different from another Burroughs book that he wrote called Exterminator. It's not the same book. This is The Exterminator. It's completely different. The Exterminator is a very rare Burroughs book, and it's one that was not popular in its day, and it's certainly one that people don't read nowadays either. Even most Burroughs fans have never read The Exterminator. Like you mentioned, it came out in 1960, and it was one of the two books, or I should say it is one of the two books that usually get referred to as the cut-up manifestos. So basically, long story short, Brian Geisen starts doing cut-ups in the Beat Hotel in early 1960, I believe, what that means is he's literally cutting up printed text and rearranging the sections to get new combinations. And this inspires Burroughs, because Burroughs sees cut-up as a way to help deprogram the human mind and alter consciousness and sort of defy demonic possession. But also later he sees cut-up as a form of divination, as a form of hyperstitional magic, or sort of a tool that writers could use to transform the writing into a magical act or a magical ritual that can change reality. So it gets expanded into all these different areas. In 1960, Geisen and Burroughs put together two small booklets of cut-up material. And these booklets are intended kind of to promote the practice of cut-up. They intend it to be like a cut-up revolution. They want everybody to do this. And they think it's going to usher in this new era of literature and art, but that didn't really happen like that. But the second of these cut-up manifestos is The Exterminator. The Exterminator is almost entirely cut-up material, unlike other Burroughs books. So it's very, very difficult to read. It's really almost unreadable, which is probably why it was never popular. I came across a very interesting sentence in there, though, that sort of caught my attention, and I'd like to read it here if I can.
Yes, please do.
The junk way to more junk in time, money, death, cleavage into private parts. Comfortable cocoon of second-run stallies. 5 Ahwa 8 Kumu insect time. Last date Mayan calendar end of insect time. So obviously this is
to make of that.
Right. This is very
imagine
difficult
somebody
to interpret.
opening this book and looking at this and going, "What?"
Right. And a majority of the text in this book is like that. It's just got a lot of like, what?
Yeah.
And if you're not familiar with other Burroughs books, it's really, really hard to read this. Like if this was the first Burroughs book you'd looked at, there's no way you could finish this,
right.
Even though it's not a long book. But so if you are familiar with other Burroughs books, you'd know that insect is a code word for these sort of archons, or these archontic masters that kind of secretly control human reality, right? These sort of invisible alien masters. So to say that the end of the Mayan calendar is the end of insect time is essentially tantamount to sort of positing the end of the Mayan calendar as a metaphysical liberation of humanity from these alien tyrants. And this is 1960, in which he says all this. This is way before McKenna begins talking about 2012. So I saw this, and so I thought, okay, maybe there's something here that's worth looking into. So I looked at the invisible landscape, and I noticed that sure enough, McKenna does cite Burroughs in the book. He cites Yahé letters. So we know that he reads Burroughs. Mm-hmm. So what's a little complicated is that McKenna doesn't bring up the Mayan calendar in the 1975 edition of The Invisible Landscape. The Mayan calendar stuff doesn't come up until the 1993 edition of The Invisible Landscape. So it isn't until later that he adopts like a Mayanist approach. But he does bring up 2012, which is at that point, which is when we knew the calendar ended. So I have a weird situation here. I don't really have a smoking gun because of this sort of the complexity of when McKenna adopts this Mayanist position, but I definitely have something interesting. So I keep looking at it. And I started thinking about this more, and I actually realized that the invisible landscapes, the narrative of the invisible landscape revolves around the McKenna brothers' journey to the Putumayo in Colombia, where they're looking for ayahuasca, which is the very same region of Colombia that Burroughs travels to in the Yahe letters 20 years earlier. So when you look at it like that, even though Yahe letters isn't cited that much in McKenna's writing, the thematic and geographical overlap there sort of makes the invisible landscape seem like a big homage to Yahe letters in a certain way. So at this point, like, I definitely know that there's some kind of connection here, and I just got to keep looking for stuff.
All right.
So and then I found this really great article on the 2012 phenomenon by a Mayanist named John Hoops. And in this article, Hoops is essentially, he critiques Hanegraaff's thesis, and he sort of points out that The Invisible Landscape is not the only book from 1975 to talk about 2012. So Jose Arguelles, who's probably the most famous advocate of the 2012 movement, he also publishes a book in 1975 called The Transformative Vision, where he mentions both the year 2012 and the Mayan calendar. So we have some type of source here that's implied, because both of these books come out in 75. So it's very likely that they're both reading somebody else. So I look into the bibliography in the Transformative Vision, and Arguelles also cites Yahe letters. So he also reads Burroughs. So we got two authors. There's actually a third author who also talks about the end of the Mayan calendar in 1975 named Frank Waters. But we have at least two authors here in 1975 talking about 2012, and they're both reading Burroughs. And where I really think the smoking gun here comes in is that in 1975, which is the year that Arguelles' book comes out, both him and Burroughs were teaching at Naropa University in Colorado. They were co-workers at the time. So now I really feel like I got something here, and it's definitely kind of taking shape.
Right.
And so sort of the only problem I had at this point was that it's extremely unlikely that McKenna or Arguelles had read The Exterminator. The Exterminator is not popular. So I needed to kind of seal the deal in some way by sort of locating this Burroughs Mayan calendar routine in a more widely read Burroughs source. And I found it when I read the 1966 edition of The Soft Machine. So in The Soft Machine, there's this chapter titled The Mayan Caper, where the protagonist drinks ayahuasca in order to go back in time to the ancient Maya Empire. And he infiltrates this sort of centipede alien master race in order to destroy their calendar. So at this point, I'm pretty confident that McKenna and Arguelles are drawing from Burroughs in this regard.
Okay, so The Soft Machine is from 66, and Burroughs is basically reiterating, but going in more detail about this insect calendar and all the things that he was talking about in The Exterminator in 1960. Is that correct? Am I understanding this correctly? Okay, because this is a lot to take in. This is a lot. Okay.
Yeah, so that's essentially my argument as to why Burroughs is kind of the source of the 2012 phenomenon. That's kind of all the circumstantial evidence that I have thus far.
And you noted in your thesis that other scholars were talking about certain things that had to do with Burroughs and this connection, but then they didn't take the next step like you did to actually publish things, because they were talking about it in communication letters or whatever with other people, conversations that they had, but they didn't seem to make the connection that you have made, if I understand correctly. Is that what you were getting at in your thesis?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So actually, John Hoops, this Mayanist that I mentioned, in 2007, he makes a post on an internet forum,
It's the internet. Okay.
where he sort of speculates that maybe Burroughs is the genesis of the 2012 prophecy, sort of the real Ur source. And he identifies a Mayan calendar reference in a very small mimeograph magazine publication that Burroughs did, which was a parody of Time magazine. This came out in 1965. But for some reason, Hoops he doesn't really follow up on this hunch, at least not in any peer-reviewed capacity. And he doesn't identify anything in the Soft Machine or the Exterminator. He doesn't identify any of these connections between Burroughs and Arguelles or Burroughs and McKenna. So yeah, I don't know. It's a very, and I've emailed him before to ask about this, and he never really got back to me. Hoops didn't.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. It's a really difficult question for me to answer. So I can't really speak for him as to why he doesn't follow up on it. Maybe he got busy and forgot about it. I mean,
I understand.
Professors are very busy people.
Okay. So if we can take a step back and just go more into a general discussion about 2012, the significance of that date and the Mayan calendar, what was it about that? If I don't, maybe this isn't an easy answer, let me know. But what was it about that prophecy that was so interesting to people like Burroughs and McKenna and Ginsberg? And I mean, why was that particular prophecy so popular with them?
It's a really great question, and it's one that I don't know if I'm able to answer. In terms of Burroughs, I think there's a number of reasons why the Mayan calendar was very fascinating for him. He was interested in the Mayans for a long time because he was always very interested in hieroglyphs. Because he has this interesting theory about how hieroglyphs work on the mind, and hieroglyphs are sort of related to his theories about cut-ups, and I can get into that later if you'd like.
Okay.
But also, in the Burroughs cosmology, time is kind of evil, so the calendar is evil. So that we have numerous things kind of going on that sort of draw his interest towards the Mayan calendar. But another thing that's really interesting about it is that he gets, he has this idea that the Mayan calendar at the time held like a telepathic influence over the Mayan slaves, over the Mayan proletariats. He believes this essentially because of some ideas that his wife Joan Vollmer had.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is very interesting. As to exactly why they believe this, I'm not sure. I think there's something about how hierarchical and how stratified Mayan society was that, and they're both sort of, free love, bohemian kind of personalities, that in their mind, it would only make sense that you could create such a rigid hierarchy of a society if there was some type of mind control at play.
Oh,
and
okay.
Yeah, and they both believed in telepathy as a reality. Burroughs and Vollmer actually did a lot of telepathy experiments, and Ginsberg himself at one point was kind of convinced that Vollmer was actually absolutely telepathic. So there's this really weird theory that Burroughs has about the calendar, and the fact that his wife dies in this accident, and that Ginsberg has a telepathic theory about Vollmer's death, that Vollmer telepathically made Burroughs do this, and so that was Ginsberg's esoteric theory about Bill's demonic possession, because she was suicidal at the time. She wanted to die. She had said so on numerous occasions. She was an alcoholic. She had polio. Bill was running around South America with boys and stuff like that.
God. Okay. All right.
So this, and if you go back and you look at the second edition of Naked Lunch, Burroughs adds some stuff in there, and he adds some stuff about the Mayan hieroglyphs in connection to his wife's death. This appears in the second edition of Naked Lunch. So there's some type of weird connection here in Burroughs' mind between the Mayan calendar and telepathy and his wife's death. And it's cosmological and esoteric, but it's also personal. So I think this is kind of the interest that Burroughs has in the Mayan calendar.
And the insect reference, however, is that something that other contemporaries of Burroughs also mention, or is that something that Burroughs thinks about and talks about in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. Burroughs was a huge sci-fi nut. He'd been reading sci-fi since he was a little boy. And so, I imagine, I'm sure he read something in Amazing Stories about like an insect kind of alien race.
Okay. Yeah.
But a couple of things you could point to is that, he has some visions at various times under various substances. And one of these visions is talked about in Junkie, where he hallucinates this entity that's sort of staring at him, and that sort of like rips from within this human body and takes over this human body. And the entity is a crab. It's an arthropod, kind of arthropodal entity. So I think that also his unique psychic sensitivity. He sort of sees his hallucinations of these arthropod figures as part of like an evil thing that's maybe actually real. But also, in the soft machine, in the Mayan caper of the soft machine, the insects are, or I should say, the alien masters are centipedes. And there's a theory in Mayanism at the time about the centipede god. So there's centipede drawings in some of the Chilam Balam books, which is this corpus of texts from a post-colonial Mayan era, which sort of recounts ancient Mayan myths, but in the Mayan language, but in the Roman alphabet. So I think the centipede connection is something he probably identified when he was studying Mayan archaeology.
Okay, so he's interpreting these hieroglyphs or other symbols in a particular way. And he is looking at this 2012 prophecy as being a liberation, and not so much like end of the world type of thing, but more of a end of the oppression. Correct?
I think it's maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah,
so, all right. Maybe we can go a little bit more into this later on as we talk more about the archons. But I did want to ask, is Burroughs the only one talking about these insects as archons, or is that a link that you have made with other things that you
any contemporaries of his that had that same type of symbolism? Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, so he's
maybe Robert Heinlein or something like that, okay. one of the sci-fi authors. But I think he read Robert Heinlein, if I recall correctly.
Okay, so outside of science fiction writers, the other, like the beat poets and other counterculture kind of icons who became icons, such as the McKenna brothers, they weren't really talking about anything about insects and aliens and archons or the like.
So there is a very interesting story that you remind me of. So I believe in 1959, Ginsberg is doing an LSD experiment in California with a stroboscope, and so he takes and this is at a psychology research facility in California, and he takes a very powerful dose of LSD and he stares at a stroboscope with his eyes closed, to doing what's called flicker induction, or sort of neurological entrainment to potentiate the effects of the psychedelic. And he freaks out. He has this ego dissolving experience where he sort of feels his soul getting sucked out of his body and like going into the wall socket and becoming part of the electrical grid.
Oh, wow.
And when this happens to him, he says the thing that he sees is he cognizes the universe itself as a giant spider that's eating itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Ginsberg, yeah, we still have this weird sort of like arthropodal insectoid kind of symbolism. But this is also, I think, this is at a stage in Ginsberg's life by which time Burroughs has already had a significant influence on him.
Right. And as you said, the science fiction influence of that time, a lot of the novels and even like comic books and things like that, we're talking about aliens as being like insects. So maybe there's a link there as well, that there was like it was like floating around in the consciousness that people were just picking up on. Something that looked so very different from a human being would be an alien. And that,
right.
For us, that would be something either arachnoid or insectoid or something like that. So that maybe that is one explanation of why the insect became the focal word that was used. But I just find it very interesting that he keeps coming back to this. I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to share about this particular question that I had asked about other people not picking up on the reference in the Exterminator. I don't know if there's anything else you want to share. If not, we can move on.
Well, so I think for me, what I still wonder about to this day, and this is something that I don't really or I haven't really addressed yet in my writing, is that I often wonder why McKenna or Arguelles don't give Burroughs kind of more explicit credit. It's something that I still think about and something that's worth considering. My guess is that Burroughs is this really controversial, kind of polarizing figure. And so maybe they're afraid to associate with him or sort of, admit that they revere him or that they're influenced by him. But Burroughs is also marketed as an author of fiction. And McKenna and Arguelles are presenting the 2012 prophecy not as fiction.
Correct.
So I also think that maybe they don't want people to know that they're getting their spiritual cues from these books that are marketed as novels. Okay,
well, that might be a good segue then to go to the next question that I had for you. Your thesis also discusses how underappreciated Burroughs is when it comes to the area of the occult. So even though these books are called fiction, there are a lot of themes and a lot of motives that are being repeated in these books that could be considered esoteric or occult in nature. And you said that he'd been very interested in all of this since childhood and had all these experiences of, I guess you could say, altered states, alterations of consciousness, and then also using the drugs that would also help to put him in those other altered modes of perception. And all of these ideas are very influential to him and his worldview, as you so, accurately stated. But you argue that despite all of this stuff going on with Burroughs, the spiritual or occult aspect of his entire body of work has been ignored by literary critics. So can you talk more about why you think this has happened?
Yeah, it's something that I'm still trying to kind of grapple with myself, but I'll sort of just give it to you as I understand it.
Okay.
To confirm what you just said, yes, Burroughs has been interested in magic and esotericism his whole life. He's a psychically sensitive child. His mother's interested in spiritualism. So he's raised in this environment where the subjects aren't really taboo. The first thing he ever published was in his high school journal or his high school newspaper when he was 15, and it's a book review of mind control lessons that he purchased. he studies witchcraft and Tibetan Buddhism at Harvard. Like I said before, him and Vollmer were doing telepathy experiments. So it just goes on and on and on throughout his whole life. And when you read Burroughs' books, you see esotericism all over the place. So in the books you can find bits of Crowley, you find bits of Reich, you find bits of Hubbard. There's references to magic, references to ayahuasca, references to alchemy, to ghosts, to demons, all these kind of weird things. And I think one of the main points of contention around the esoteric topics in his books is how serious he is about this stuff. Like, does he really believe in it, or is this just kind of a way for him to get copy for a fun and unique kind of fictional universe? And a couple of literary critics have suggested that he's not serious about this. That he doesn't really believe in this stuff. But if you read his biographers, if you read Ted Morgan or Barry Miles, or you listen to anyone from his inner circle that knew him well, such as Genesis P. Orridge, they'll tell you that he's quite serious about this kind of stuff. He really believed in demons, and he really believed that magic worked, and that he was doing magic in his personal life and trying to curse people and all kinds of strange stuff like that. In terms of why literary critics have ignored this dimension of his work, or why they try to explain it away and sort of like sweep it under the rug, it's hard for me to say. I admittedly don't have a strong background in literary studies. My background's in history and anthropology. And I'm trying to learn more about literary studies these days so I can, improve the quality of my work. But if I had to guess, I would say that as far as I know, something happened to literary criticism in the middle of the 20th century with movements like New Criticism or people like Roland Barthes, where it became very fashionable to sort of ignore what fiction authors thought about their own work. And this seems especially true if the work has any kind of spiritual dimension to it. First of all, I think critics ignore Burroughs' esoteric dimensions because they can, or I might also say they don't deal with Burroughs' esoteric dimensions because they don't have to. But that kind of still leaves us with the question as to why more critics aren't interested in esotericism to begin with, and we really can't answer that for them. But I tend to think that, or I guess I should. Maybe it's an assumption of mine, but I think there's circumstantial evidence to verify this, that there's still a lot of religious prejudice in the academy. The 20th century saw all these massive developments in civil rights movements for feminism, racial minorities, LGBTQ. All these social liberation movements eventually became championed in academia and are still championed in academia today. But esotericists are also a type of minority, I would argue. They're a religious minority, and they've suffered a lot of discrimination for thousands of years. They continue to suffer discrimination today, but they never got a liberation movement. And this is something that Ginsberg actually talks about. To this very day, it's completely socially acceptable for scholars to make really bigoted sweeping generalizations about esotericism and magic. And it's totally fine for them to do it in print, in peer-reviewed contexts. And I think we see some of that in Burroughs studies as well. Like, there's scholars, whenever Burroughs scholars are forced to acknowledge some type of esoteric dimension of his life or his writing, they always accompany these statements with some type of derogatory sidebar where they go like, well, but we all know magic is stupid and occultism is silly, and that, it's a shame that Burroughs was so gullible to believe in these ridiculous things. Even though he was a genius writer, he was ultimately a foolish man or something like that. And this is just, in my opinion, the way I look at it, this is just kind of a widespread and openly accepted bigotry that still exists in the academy. And I think this disincentivizes people to look at things like magic.
I would agree with that. And I think you are perhaps one of the first who are trying to change that. They're trying to be more open and accepting to other interpretations and not be so pejorative. So I commend you for that.
Oh, well, thank you.
Please join us for part 2, where we discuss the cut-up method, the archons, Gnosticism, and magic in more detail.